Hello, my beautiful friends. I am Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you rest, relax, and fall asleep, all while deepening in your connection with your beautiful team of angels who love you so. If we're meeting for the first time, I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. It's the best job ever, and I do this through one-on-one angel sessions, soul mentoring, and a variety of classes designed to inspire your spirit. And you can learn more at my website, illuminatingsouls.com. But for now, the angels and I are here to help you come into a good state of sleep. And I do acknowledge that there are those of you who listen during the daytime. And so if your intention is not to sleep, then it is my blessing to be a companion to you for a little while as you go about your day. And however you are guided to use this podcast, it is truly a blessing to be with you. So as I record this, we are having a bright and beautiful day. And so I share this bright and beautiful energy with you. I share the sweetness of this moment with you. And just take some nice deep breaths in and out. And if you are preparing for bed, I invite you to cozy on up and snuggle on in. Just curling up in your bed or wherever it is that you sleep. Just allowing your body to get comfortable. I don't know how it is for you, but have you ever had a pet that circles around and paws at the bedding before they settle in just so? I think I do the human version of that. So it's not so much that I circle, but I fluff up the covers, and then I shift my body, and then I plump up the pillows. It's really quite a production for me to get comfortable in bed, and more often than not, I get in bed before my husband does, so he misses that whole rigmarole. But when he's gotten in bed before I do, which is rare, but it happens, I then become very aware of how much I fluff covers and pillows when I get in bed, so it'll be just right. So I invite you to fluff and plump and wriggle your body just right so that everything is supported in a way that works for you. And we'll take some more nice deep breaths in and out. And listen, I know you breathe all the time because you are here, but there is something about that deep, intentional breath that helps us get centered in the moment. And I invite you to set your intention for our time together. And this doesn't have to be heavy lifting. It can be as simple as setting your intention to receive the love of the angels through this podcast. Isn't that a sweet invitation? just come into your heart and set your intention. It is my intention to receive the love of the angels as I listen to this podcast. And just breathe that in and allow the love to flow to you. Your angels have loved you since before you were born. They are aware of all that is transpiring for you, and they are here to support you. And I'm going to call the angels in, even though they are already here. But this way you can acknowledge that they are here as well. So beautiful angels on high, I invite you to join us here. I ask that you bring forward waves of love for each of our beloveds listening to this broadcast. I ask that you bring forth waves of healing, waves of light, and waves of inspiration that will support them in ways that are meaningful and in service to their highest and best goods. And angels, I ask that you clear each of our energy fields through the heart of God, helping to clear anything that does not belong to us. And angels, please bring our bodies infusions of healing light, bringing forth waves of well-being and balance. And dear ones, just focus on the sound of my voice and the loving energy that is present as you make space to drift off into sleep. You have done enough for today, and this is your time to rest. And you can visualize, imagine, allow it to be so that the angels are filling the room that you are in with a soft pink light. And this light is filled with the love of the divine, calibrated just for you. And this beautiful pink light can also expand to all of those that you love, to all of those who love you. And through time and space. So just take some breaths in, sending waves of relaxation down your body. Breathing deep into your solar plexus. Feeling the loving in your own heart expand as you receive the blessings from on high. You are precious in this world. You are one of the ways that God breathes more love into this planet. And the angels are bringing forward waves of gratitude for you. They say thank you for the way you show up in this world. Thank you for your beautiful heart. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for being you, because the world is better because you are here. So just breathe and receive the gratitude and the love that is here for you. And allow yourself to rest. And while you rest, I'm going to read you a story. And I know in this episode we're coming into the story a bit early, but I thought it would be nice to have a longer expanse of story time. I want to see how this goes. And in this episode, I am guided to return to one of my favorite books, which is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. For those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know that I love this book. And if you're new to our broadcast, and if this is the first Anne episode that you're listening to, I will give you a rambling, meandering recap of where we are. I say it that way because I listen to the Sleepy Bookshelf. It is one of the sleep podcasts that I also listen to, in addition to this one. And they write such wonderful recaps. So there's this professionally written recap that happens before the episodes, and I love them, and I think, well, those are not mine. I ramble, and I figured it's okay to ramble because it's a sleep podcast, and the intention is for you to fall asleep at some point, and so maybe you won't even hear this, but if you do, I'll catch you up. So Anne is an orphan who is adopted by brother and sister Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert. We know that Matthew is around 60 years old because they say that in the book, and I would assume Marilla's within a few years of him, so they're older. And their farm is called Green Gables, and they live in Avonlea. It is the early 1900s, maybe the late 1800s. They still get around by horse and wagon, so maybe it's a little earlier than the 1900s, but it's somewhere around that time. And when they decided to adopt a child, they did so thinking they would be able to help around the farm because they're both getting older, and they thought they would be adopting a boy. But when Matthew went to the train station to pick up their new family member, it was Anne, who is very clearly a girl. And Anne has bright red hair and freckles, and she talks a mile a minute, and she's got this vivid imagination. Anne's inner world is big, and she has a big appetite for life. And something you should know about Matthew is that he is painfully shy. These days, we might even say that he has social anxiety. Like he just won't talk to people. Especially women, he is completely flummoxed by anyone of the female persuasion, except for Marilla and Anne, and sometimes their neighbor, Mrs. Lynde. But that's pretty much his comfort zone when it comes to talking to women. So we pick up the story. Anne has already been living with Matthew and Marilla for about a year now. She's found her place in the family, and in Avonlea, her best friend, her bosom friend as she calls her, is Diana Barry, who lives on the farm next door. And Anne has really wanted to have a dress with puffed sleeves. Puffed sleeves are the fashion of the day. And all the other little girls have dresses with puffed sleeves. But alas, Marilla is a deeply practical woman with no imagination. I say that because Anne has a huge imagination and Marilla is profoundly practical. And so she makes Anne's dresses very plainly, straight arms, not a puff in sight. And one day or evening, I forget what time of day it is, Matthew is observing Anne with her girlfriends. And he notices that there is something different about Anne. And he, of all people, recognizes that all the other little girls have puffed sleeves, but Anne does not. So he is inspired to get a dress made for Anne for Christmas. And of course, this dress will have puffed sleeves, which is a wonderful idea. The hiccup is, however, it is going to require him to go to town and ask to buy a dress for Anne, and this terrifies him. He does not handle these kinds of interactions well. You know, it's one thing if he's asking to buy hay, that's in his wheelhouse, but to ask to buy a dress for a girl was just too much for him. But he makes a good attempt at it, and he goes into one of the local stores, and wouldn't you know it, the old man who's usually behind the counter was not there. Instead, his niece was there, and she had bangles on her wrists, and Matthew was flummoxed. So he wound up buying a rake that he did not need. He wound up buying 20 pounds of brown sugar that he did not need, all because he was too nervous and mortified to talk to a woman about buying the dress. So he tries to explain to Marilla why she is now the recipient of 20 pounds of brown sugar when she does not need it, and it is not the kind that she likes. And then when he went to ponder what he would do, he realized that what he should do is ask Mrs. Lynde to help, because Mrs. Lynde liked Anne. She had good fashion sense, and Matthew, I don't know that he liked to talk to her, but he would talk to her, right? She was in his uncomfortable comfort zone, if that makes sense. So we're going to pick the book up here where Matthew has decided to talk to Mrs. Lynde about Anne's dress. I read a little bit of this in the last Anne of Green Gables episode, but I decided to start here because it picks up the thread of the story here. So here we go. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. And what he's referring to is getting Anne's dress made. Marilla was out of the question. Matthew felt sure she would throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde, for of no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hands. Pick out a dress for you to give to Anne? To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow and I'll attend to it. Have you something particular in mind? No? Well, I'll just go by my own judgment then. I believe a nice rich brown would just suit Anne. And William Blair has some new Gloria in that's real pretty. Perhaps you'd like me to make it up for her too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before the time and spoil the surprise. Well, I'll do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing. I'll make it to fit my niece Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure goes. Well, now I'm much obliged, said Matthew, and I don't know, but I like to think that they make the sleeves different nowadays to what they used to be. If it wouldn't be asking too much, I'd like them made in the new way. Puffs? Of course. You needn't worry a speck more about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion, said Mrs. Lynde. To herself she added when Matthew had gone, It'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor child wearing something decent for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous, that's what. And I've ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice and she thinks she knows more about bringing children up than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way. Folks that has brought up children know that there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. Just set your 3 terms down, so fashion, and the sum will work out correctly. But flesh and blood doesn't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes her mistake. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility in Anne by dressing her as she does, but it's more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls. But to think of Matthew taking notice of it. That man is waking up after being asleep for over 60 years. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess until Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it is very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. So this is what Matthew has been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it? She said a little stiffly but tolerantly. I knew he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything is more a sheer extravagance. There's enough material in those sleeves alone to make a waist. I declare there is. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she is as vain as a peacock now. Well, I hope she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after those silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she never said a word after the first. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. They're as big as balloons now. Next year, anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways. Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December and people had looked forward to a green Christmas, but just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs, singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. Merry Christmas, Marilla. Merry Christmas, Matthew. Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I am so glad it is white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? Well, I don't like green Christmases. They're not green. They're just nasty faded browns and grays. What makes people call them green? Why, Matthew, is that for me? Oh, Matthew. Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A lovely, soft brown Gloria, with all the gloss of silk, a skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves, they were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them 2 beautiful puffs, divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. "That's a Christmas present for you, Anne," said Matthew shyly. "Why, Anne, don't you like it?" Well now, for Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. "Like it? Oh, Matthew!" Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. "Matthew, it is perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream." "Well, let us have breakfast," interrupted Marilla. "I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in." "I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast," said Anne rapturously. "Breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I am so glad that puffed sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in the future, but somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I will really make an effort after this." When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. "Merry Christmas, Diana. And oh, it is a wonderful Christmas. I have something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress with such sleeves. I couldn't even imagine any nicer." "I've got something more for you," said Diana breathlessly. "Here. This box Aunt Josephine sent out to us, a big box with ever so many things in it. And this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come until after dark, and I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now." Anne opened the box and peeped in. First, a card with "For the Anne girl and Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. "Oh," said Anne, "Diana, this is too much. I must be dreaming." "I call it providential," said Diana. "You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they're 2 sizes too big for you. and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. Josie Pye would be delighted. Mind you, Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from the practice night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that? All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was a pronounced success. The little hall was crowded, all the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the bright particular star of the occasion, as even envy in the shape of Josie Pye dared not deny. "Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening," sighed Anne when it was all over and she and Diana were walking home together under a dark, starry sky. "Everything went off very well," said Diana practically. "I guess we must have made as much as $10. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it back to the Charlottetown newspapers." "Oh, Diana, will we really see our names in print? It makes me thrilled to think of it." "Your solo was perfectly elegant, Diana. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, it is my dear bosom friend who is so honored." "Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid." "Oh, I was so nervous, Diana. When Mr. Allen called out my name, I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking at me and through me, and for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all, and then I thought of my lovely puffed sleeves and took courage. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Diana. So I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I felt just like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced those recitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never been able to get through. Did I groan all right?" "Yes, indeed, you groaned lovely," assured Diana. "I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I had touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed." "Wasn't the boys' dialogue fine?" said Diana. "Gilbert Blythe was just splendid. Anne, I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. There now. You're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased at that." "It's nothing to me what that person does," said Anne loftily. "I simply never waste a thought on him, Diana." That night, Marilla and Matthew, who'd been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat for a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. "Well now, I guess our Anne did as well as any of them," said Matthew proudly. "Yes, she did," admitted Marilla. "She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, although I'm not going to tell her so." "Well now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her so before she went upstairs," said Matthew. "We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea school by and by." "There's time enough to think of that," said Marilla. "She's only 13 in March, though tonight it struck me that she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queens after a spell. But nothing need to be said about that for another year or two. Well, now, it'll do no harm to be thinking it over off and on, said Matthew. Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over. And we're now coming to chapter 26. The story club is formed. Junior Avonlea found it hard to settle down to the humdrum existence again. To Anne in particular, things seemed fearfully flat, stale, and unprofitable after the goblet of excitement she had been sipping for weeks. Could she go back to the former quiet pleasures of those faraway days before the concert? At first, as she told Diana, she did not really think she could. I'm positively certain, Diana, that life can never be quite the same again as it was in those olden days, she said mournfully, as if referring to a period of at least 50 years back. Perhaps after a while I'll get used to it, but I'm afraid concerts spoil people for everyday life. I suppose that is why Marilla disapproves of them. Marilla is such a sensible woman. It must be a great deal better to be sensible, but still, I don't believe I'd really want to be a sensible person because they are so unromantic. Mrs. Lynde says there's no danger of my ever being one, but you never can tell. I feel just now that I may grow up to be sensible yet, but perhaps that is only because I'm tired. I simply couldn't sleep last night ever so long. I just lay awake and imagine the concert over and over again. That's one splendid thing about such affairs. It's so lovely to look back to them. Eventually, however, Avonlea School slipped back into its old groove and took up its old interests. To be sure, the concert left traces. Ruby Gillis and Emma White, who had quarreled over a point of precedence in their platform seats, no longer sat at the same desk, and a promising friendship of 3 years was broken up. Josie Pye and Julia Bell did not speak for 3 months because Josie Pye had told Bessie Wright that Julia Bell's bow, when she got up to recite, made her think of a chicken jerking its head, and Bessie told Julia. None of the Sloanes would have any dealings with the Bells because the Bells had declared that the Sloanes had too much to do in the program, and the Sloanes had retorted that the Bells were not capable of doing the little that they had to do properly. Finally, Charlie Sloane fought Moody Spurgeon McPherson because Moody Spurgeon had said that Anne Shirley put on airs about her recitations, and Moody Spurgeon was licked. Consequently, Moody Spurgeon's sister Ella May would not speak to Anne Shirley all the rest of the winter. With the exception of these trifling frictions, work in Miss Stacy's little kingdom went on with regularity and smoothness. Well, the winter weeks slipped away, and it was unusually mild winter, with so little snow that Anne and Diana could go to school nearly every day by way of the birch path. On Anne's birthday, they were tripping lightly down it, keeping eyes and ears alert amid all their chatter, for Miss Stacy had told them that they must soon write a composition on a winter's walk in the woods, and it behooved them to be observant. Just think, Diana, I am 13 years old today, remarked Anne in an awed voice. I can scarcely realize that I'm in my teens. When I woke up this morning, it seemed to me that everything must be different. Well, you've been 13 for a month, so I suppose it doesn't seem like such a novelty to you as it does to me. It makes life seem so much more interesting. In 2 more years, I'll be really grown up. It's a great comfort to think that I'll be able to use big words then without being laughed at. Ruby Gillis thinks of nothing but beaux, said Anne disdainfully. She's actually delighted when anyone writes her name up in a take notice, for all she pretends to be so mad. But I'm afraid that it is uncharitable speech. Mrs. Allen said we should never make up uncharitable speeches, but they do slip out so often before you think, don't they? I simply can't talk about Josie Pye without making an uncharitable speech, so I never mention her at all. You may have noticed that. I'm trying to be as much like Mrs. Allen as I possibly can because I think she's perfect. Mr. Allen thinks so too. Mrs. Lynde says he just worships the ground she treads on, and she doesn't really think it right for a minister to set his affections so much on a mortal being. But then, Diana, even ministers are human and have their besetting sins just like everybody else. I had such an interesting talk with Mrs. Allen about besetting sins last Sunday afternoon. There are just a few things it's proper to talk about on Sundays, and that is one of them. My besetting sin is imagining too much and forgetting my duties. I'm striving very hard to overcome it, and now that I'm really 13, perhaps I'll get on better. In 4 more years, we'll be able to put our hair up, said Diana. Alice Bell is only 16 and she is wearing hers up, but I think that's ridiculous. I shall wait until I'm 17. If I had Alice Bell's crooked nose, said Anne decidedly, I wouldn't, but there. I won't say what I was going to say because it was extremely uncharitable. Besides, I was comparing it with my own nose, and that's vanity. I'm afraid I think too much about my nose ever since I heard that compliment about it so long ago. It really is a great comfort to me. Oh, Diana, look, there's a rabbit. That's something to remember for our woods composition. I really think the woods are just as lovely as winter as in summer. They're so white and still as if they were asleep and dreaming pretty dreams. I won't mind writing that composition when its time comes, sighed Diana. I can manage to write about the woods, but the one we are to hand in on Monday is terrible. The idea of Miss Stacy telling us to write a story out of our own heads. Why, it's easy as a wink, said Anne. It's easy for you because you have an imagination, retorted Diana. But what would you do if you had been born without one? I suppose you have your composition all done? Anne nodded, trying hard not to look virtuously complacent and failing miserably. I wrote it last Monday evening. It's called The Jealous Rival, or In Death Not Divided. I read it to Marilla, and she said it was stuff and nonsense. Then I read it to Matthew, and he said it was fine. That is the kind of critic I like. It's a sad, sweet story. I just cried like a child while I was writing it. It's about 2 beautiful maidens called Cordelia Montmorency and Geraldine Seymour, who live in the same village and were devotedly attached to each other. Cordelia was a regal brunette with a coronet of midnight hair and duskly flashing eyes. Geraldine was a queenly blonde with hair like spun gold and velvety purple eyes. I never saw anybody with purple eyes, said Diana dubiously. Neither did I just imagined them. I wanted something out of the common. Geraldine had an alabaster brow, too. I found out what an alabaster brow is. That is one of the advantages of being 13. You know so much more than you did when you were only 12. Well, what became of Cordelia and Geraldine? Asked Diana, who was beginning to feel rather interested in their fate. They grew in beauty side by side until they were 16. Then Bertram de Vere came to their native village and fell in love with the fair Geraldine. He saved her life when her horse ran away with her in a carriage, and she fainted in his arms, and he carried her home 3 miles because you understand the carriage was all smashed up. I found it rather hard to imagine the proposal because I had no experience to go by. I asked Ruby Gillis if she knew anything about how men proposed because I thought she'd likely be an authority on the subject, having so many sisters married. Ruby told me she was hid in the hall pantry when Malcolm Andres proposed to her sister Susan. She said Malcolm told Susan that his dad had given him the farm in his own name and then said, "What do you say, darling pet, if we get hitched this fall?" And Susan said, "Yes. No, I don't know. Let me see." And then they were engaged as quick as that. But I didn't think that sort of proposal was a very romantic one. So in the end, I had to imagine it all out as well as I could. It made it very flowery and poetical, and Bertram went on his knees, although Ruby Gillis says it isn't done nowadays. Geraldine accepted him and his speech a page long. I can tell you I took a lot of trouble with that speech. I rewrote it 5 times, and I look upon it as my masterpiece. Bertram gave her a diamond ring and a ruby necklace and told her they would go to Europe for a wedding tour, for he was immensely wealthy. But then, alas, shadows began to darken over their path. Cordelia was secretly in love with Bertram herself, and when Geraldine told her about the engagement, she was simply furious, especially when she saw the necklace and the diamond ring. All her affection for Geraldine turned to bitter hate, and she vowed that she would never marry Bertram. But she pretended to be Geraldine's friend, the same as ever. One evening they were standing on the bridge over a rushing, turbulent stream, and Cordelia, thinking they were alone, pushed Geraldine over the brink with a mild, mocking, "Ha-ha!" But Bertram saw it all, and at once he plunged into the current, exclaiming, "I will save thee, my peerless Geraldine." But alas, he had forgotten he couldn't swim, and they were both drowned, clasped in each other's arms. Their bodies were washed ashore soon afterwards. They were buried in the one grave, and their funeral was most imposing, Diana. It's so much more romantic to end a story with a funeral than a wedding. Sorry, this is Laurel. I'm just laughing at that. She's so dramatic. That's what I love about our Anne. She would write for soap operas if they were a thing back then. As for Cordelia, she went insane with remorse and was shut up in a lunatic asylum. I thought that was a poetical retribution for her crime. How perfectly lovely, sighed Diana, who belonged to Matthew's school of critics. I don't see how you can make up such thrilling things out of your own head, Anne. I wish my imagination was as good as yours. Well, it would be if only you'd cultivate it, said Anne cheeringly. I've just thought of a plan, Diana. Let you and me have a story club all our own and write stories for practice. I'll help you along until you can do them by yourself. You ought to cultivate your imagination, you know. Miss Stacy says so. Only we must take it the right way. I told her about the haunted wood, but she said we went about that in the wrong way. And this was how the story club came into existence. It was limited to Diana and Anne at first, but soon it was extended to include Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis, and 1 or 2 of the others who felt that their imaginations needed cultivating. No boys were allowed in it, though, although Ruby Gillis opined that their admission would make it more exciting, and each member had to produce 1 story a week. And so, my beautiful friends, we're going to leave off here. How delightful would it be to have a story club like that, right? Where we write down stories of our imagination and then read them to each other. So here's to our imaginations. And I also want to apologize if you're hearing the ambient noise. I'm recording this in the afternoon and my neighborhood is a bit louder than it normally is in the early mornings when I record. But perhaps by now you have drifted off into the sweetest of dreams. So I wish you a good rest. I wish you happiness and well-being. I wish you sparks of inspiration. And I'm so deeply grateful for you. So thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to spend this time with you. I'm so deeply grateful for the gift of you. So you rest well, and we'll connect again soon. Thank you.